Greetings and welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of Poly Weekly News. I'm your host, David Danto, and we have an interesting show this week. My guest is a rocket scientist. Well, no, he follows rocket scientists. Doug, why don't you take a second to introduce yourself, and then we'll talk about what we're talking about.
Thank you, David. I'm happy to be here once again. I cover, outside of my day job, I cover or follow the space industry, specifically things, the intersection between space and IT. So there's some interesting things going on when you start talking about Microsoft and Amazon and SpaceX and things like that. So I do part of the time I write about space, and a part of the time I do some analytical work as well. I'm looking to see, what could be next or what is next.
No, that's great. Thank you. And again, thank you for coming back with us now. The reason I asked you here is because of rocket science. It's because this week we actually sent you got to correct me if I get these terms wrong, because you know it better than I do. We said you stayed up for it actually 3 times, 2 misses, and then you got it. The Artemis 1 mission, which is the Orion spacecraft, was sent out to the moon unmanned, but we were testing out the technology, right? To finally, after more than 50 years, to head back to the moon and explore again.
Yeah, I mean, well, welcome to. I mean, the space shuttle was good, but the space shuttle wasn't designed for deep space. And once there's a long and sordid story as to the amount of money that's been spent on Artemis and SLS, the Space Launch System, or as Bill Nelson likes to call it, the big rocket. But it finally got off the pad successfully and put the Orion spacecraft on a trajectory to the moon. And Orion looks pretty good right now. And, it's will be headed on its way to come back home in a couple of days.
So it was orbiting the moon in a retrograde orbit, which took the unmanned, they're mannequins, but it took the unmanned capsule further out into deep space than any capsule intended to be manned has ever gone before, correct?
Correct, yes. I think that Elon Musk sent his Tesla with a guy with a spacesuit mannequin out to the orbit of Mars, but that's a different story for a different day. But yeah, in terms of a crewed space capsule, okay, this is the first uncrewed test flight for Artemis. The next Artemis mission will be a crewed flight with people on it in preparation for a lunar landing.
And we can look at some of the animation now from NASA, because my niece works for NASA, so but these are publicly available animations. It looks like there are 4 solar panels that are on what I guess is the command module for this.
No, service module.
Service module. Yeah. Service module. Okay. So yeah, I don't know what the terms are. The last time men were on the moon, the last 2 people to walk on the moon were Gene Cernan. Last 2 Americans, Gene Cernan and Jack Schmitt, correct?
Yes.
And that was 1972.
Yep.
Apollo 17. And they lamented as they were leaving the moon. They were hoping that we would be back soon, and 50 years ain't soon.
Well, part of the issue with you see, the Cold War was kind of over. There wasn't that urgency involved. The space race of the 60s was Cold War competition, which I think drove the best in NASA in the space program at that time. But after the Apollo missions, there wasn't a clear path to what do we do next. And the fact of the matter is we got sidelined with the space shuttle. And from there, with the space shuttle, we kind of had another, I don't want to say lapse of faith, but a lapse of mission. Where do we go after the space shuttle? And now the flag is Artemis, and now that Artemis is flying to go back to the moon, we're on track to do good things again.
Yeah, no, it's exciting. And I brought over my mission patches
Oh, wow.
from all of the Apollo missions. These are not originals; these are replicas.
Yeah.
But you can see from all of them, and I have a few that don't fit in here, of course, like Skylab and a few others. But
Yeah.
these are some amazing things that if you've never understood, if you've never followed what happened in NASA in the '60s with Apollo and things like that, you should by all means, at least on HBO, catch From the Earth to the Moon, which is a great series, and it really explains what we went through to make it, to live with it, what the people were like. It's a good set of stories.
Yeah, I think that yeah, there have been a lot of different fictional and non-fictional accounts or semi-fictional accounts of how we got to the moon, and but I think that now we're in a time where we're actually serious about doing deep space exploration that is beyond Earth orbit once again, and Artemis is a good starting point for that. I mean, there are a lot of folks in NASA are thinking, hoping, planning that we'll get to a point where we explore more of the moon, establish a long-term presence on the moon for research, and that'll be a building block to get us to Mars.
Understood. And I'm all for those plans. But a lot of you may be asking, what does this have to do with poly? And what does this have to do with HP? And I actually wanted to make that connection. The reason we're bringing it up is not just because this is our Thanksgiving show, and we were trying to keep it a little bit lighter than the heavy technical that we do. But there's a great story there. I have been married to my wife for 30 years. Actually, December 30th, it's going to be 31 years that I've been married to my wife.
Terrific.
Prior to meeting her, which was like a year and a half, 2 years before our wedding, we'd never met. But we went to the same schools. My father sold her mother their house. My sister and her brother were classmates, but we had never met. And it was this karma thing that we would come back together, that we were introduced by mutual friends, that would bring us back together. But it was sort of together but never parted. And that's really the HP Poly story. The folks at Poly, as you know, is a combination of Polycom and Plantronics. The original Plantronics legacy in the '60s built the headsets that brought you the all of the words from all of the Apollo astronauts and the Gemini astronauts. The story is that Wally Schirra was very disappointed and unhappy with the heavy headsets that he had to wear, and they wanted to find something that would fit inside the helmet and actually be part of the Snoopy cap. And that's when he reached out to the two engineers at Plantronics who built the headset that brought us those immortal words, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, and everything else from the Gemini and Apollo missions. And while we didn't know them at the time intimately, HP was right there. Inside that very same Snoopy cap were solid state switches from HP. And there were a lot of other technologies that HP brought to the Gemini and the Apollo missions. One was an 8-channel recording system. I believe it was called the Sanborn 350, that was taking all of the readings of people's bodies and the craft, things that would need to be reviewed later on to make sure that it would be safe. It's too much to record. And it was doing that. And also the cesium beam frequency and time standard frequencies, all the things that kept the clocks running, that kept everything aligned inside the Apollo ships, were all HP products. So this story of HP and Poly being together early on, attending the same schools, having their mom and dad know each other, but not getting together until just recently, is actually kind of an interesting story that tracks with Apollo and going to the moon. So that's one of the reasons why it's an exciting Poly story, and one of the reasons I'm very hopeful that we're on the Poly headsets are on the Crew Dragon. They're all over the place right now in terms of NASA, and we're very hopeful that we will be able to use our technology, Polys and HPs, to again strides, as you point out, moon base, Mars mission, manned Mars mission, finally in our lifetime perhaps, and who knows where else that might go.
Well, I know that you're emphasizing the Poly side of the house right now, but I'll speak up for the HP side of the house. One of the things that HP is looking at is doing edge computing in space. And there have been tests on the International Space Station to use basically an HP, I don't want to say supercomputer, but that's what HP calls it. So we'll use HP supercomputer to do high performance compute tasks on the locally on the International Space Station. Now, as you move farther away from Earth, communication delays are such that you need to do more compute on site the farther away you go, especially for time sensitive things. You can't, like, for instance, if you're expecting to, you can't really run a remote real-time robot on the moon without lag. And, if you've got a half second or more lag, you may end up steering your remote robot into a ditch if you're trying to go anywhere fast. So there's going to be a lot of instances where you're going to take your compute with you, and HP's proving this out in low Earth orbit, and they'll be also proving it out when the orbiting gateway is put up around the moon. And then, I think ultimately, getting local compute put in on the long-term presence that'll get set up on the moon as well, and then ultimately onto Mars. So it's going to be pretty interesting to see how those things advance as we move forward and move outward.
Oh, absolutely. And we're well into the realm of speculation at this point, in intelligent speculation, but speculation. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the last space shuttle mission, or possibly the International Space Station, we actually finally 3D printed a tool that was used to do some repairs. 3D printing in space is going to be much more convenient than having to get a FedEx truck to drive all the way out to where they're going to deliver a tool. So the ability to have that advanced printing to be able to make the things that you need is going to become more and more important.
Yes, they're printing a lot of 3D things out in this space station. They've done, there's actually a movement not only to print things on this space station, but also to have a sort of, I don't want to say closed loop, but a more economic loop where they'll be able to take things like if you print things, what do you need? You need printer filament, right? Which is plastic. So one of the things that they're looking at is being able to recycle both plastics on station as well as plastics from things like food wrappers, and then use that and melt it down, do other magic. I'm not going to understand the material science, but basically turn that into filament that they can use to put in the 3D printer in order to print out widgets. If you break a ratchet or a screwdriver or something, you're 3 days away from Earth, and the next supply launch isn't for like 4 months, then printing on site makes a lot of sense. So there's a look at that in terms of printing material goods or material widgets, literally widgets, on site, in orbit, and then ultimately on the moon's surface. So part of that ecosystem is not only 3D printing, but also materials processing, so you can recycle things rather than actually having to send up a rack of filament, being able to use stuff and being able to recycle plastics in order to feed the 3D printer. But in addition to 3D printing widgets, there are experiments going on right now where they're actually printing, they're starting to print human organ analogs on orbit on the space station. So they're looking at printing things like cartilage replacement for knees is one of the things that went up a couple of weeks ago on a supply mission to the International Space Station. So basically, the cargo ship that went up out of Wallops Island had a rack of equipment and a bunch of supplies. So that'll get moved into the space station. They'll plug in a bunch of stuff, and then they'll turn it on, and it'll start to 3D print cartilage replacement for your knee, which may be better than trying to grow it down on Earth, because in a lack of, with little gravity environment, you can print things a lot better. It simulates the amniotic environment that you'd see when in a developing human during pregnancy.
So if we sum all of this conversation up, we're headed back to the moon. It's going to take a few years, but we're going to get there. we are again discovering that space exploration is a generator of technology advancement,
Yes.
and right on the cutting edge of a lot of those pieces as well. I'm going to be very happily married 31 years, December 30th, and Polly and HP are very happily married now. In dating that goes back to the 1960s and the NASA Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo missions. So all very exciting stuff. Doug, if anybody wanted to reach out to you and pick your brain with some of these other fascinating things around space tourism and travel and exploration, how would somebody reach out to you?
Best way to get a hold of me on that would be DMOHNEY139 at gmail.com for right now.
Terrific. Doug, thanks very much for joining us and giving us your perspective on where things are going and
Thank you.
where things have been. And I always appreciate being fact check on because I got the confused. The Artemis is the mission, Orion is the spacecraft, but I won't forget the Saturn V and the rockets.
Yeah, and Saturn V, which looks a lot like the SLS of today.
Yes, it does. There was very little reason to change things that were working. But there are some reusable pieces, which I read also they're having some problems with, right? One of the reusable pieces came back a little damaged, and they want to look at that a little bit more.
The issue was with the launch pad. It
hurt the launch pad. That was right. Yes.
Yes, the launch pad. The rocket was a little bit more powerful than they anticipated. So they're going to have to go back and I guess fix some things and take some more things off. So the next time they launch, they don't. A
little more aluminum foil, or what was it? It was nickel. So I forget what it was. That was in the ship that they used to get onto the insulation for the moon. The other thing is we're going to add back into the American lexicon the term splashdown. We're going to have a splashdown just off of the coast of San Diego, I'm told. We're a little more accurate than we used to be, and I'll show some images of what they expect the splashdown to take a look like. But that's much better than having ships all around the world, coastal Century, Quebec, and everywhere else looking for this recovery for not knowing where the ship's going to go. So I think we've improved that splashdown just a little bit, right?
Yeah, our math's a lot better. Yeah, and the thing is that whenever we get astronauts coming back from the space station now, most of them splash down as well in the off the Florida coast too. So it's been a really good revival of our human capabilities to put people up and down in space. So yeah.
Awesome. Doug, again, thanks very much. That's it for this week's edition of Poly Weekly News. I'm your host, David Danto. For everyone at Poly at HP, thank you very much for watching. We really appreciate it. We'll see you next week.